Okay, so today we're going to be answering the question, where are we going? We're also going to be telling the last two E's of the Jewish story. So the first three that we have covered, Eden, election, Exodus. The last two we're going to cover today, empire and exile and return. So first of all, you need to understand that there are what is called the 12 tribes of Israel. When Israelites are referred to, we're talking about the 12 tribes of Israel, and these are the ancestors of the Jewish people. Now, according to Jewish tradition, Abraham's grandson was named Jacob, and Jacob's had a name change. It was also known as Israel. That's where we get this idea of Israel, the state of Israel, Israelites, etc. And then, if you take a look at the sons, these were the different women that Israel had children with. If you take a look at all the sons of Israel, Jacob or Israel, you will find the one that the Jewish people are named after. And I think you can figure that. Which grandson of Abraham, great-grandson of Abraham, do we get the word Jew from? And I think you can figure that out. Judah. So there was this exodus from the promised land, exodus to the promised land from Egypt, wandering in the desert according to the Jewish story, and then their goal was to conquer the promised land, but of course Moses did not accomplish that goal, and so we have the conquest of the promised land taking place after Moses' death, led by Joshua. Bring up Joshua's name because that will have significance in another religion that we study later. And the 12 tribes conquered together but settled different lands, and you can see that in this map. This is an approximation of the different tribes. Here's Judah down here, and what areas they settled in the promised land after the conquest that they write about in their sacred text. And so then we have, within about 200 years, this period that's called, E for empire. Israel becomes a kingdom. Up until, for 200 years, it's just the tribes living according to tribal expectations and the mitzvot of the Torah. But eventually they become a kingdom, and they are united, the 12 tribes are united by the second king of Israel, King David. And the capital of Israel is established in Jerusalem, near the Dead Sea. And Jerusalem is also known as Zion. They call it Mount Zion. It's on what us Californians would consider a hill compared to our Sierras, but it's often called Mount Zion in Tanakh poetry, etc. And so then I would like you to, do you remember from your notes what this thing was called? Or you could look at your Quizlet. When was it built? And where was it built? The reason I bring that up is because David's son, King Solomon, builds a temple modeled after that tabernacle tent that was built during the Sinai experience, during the Exodus, according to Jewish tradition. And King Solomon built this temple. He was King David's son and successor, and he fashioned it after that tabernacle. And if we had time, we could look at some of the detail. It's quite rich, with a lot of gilded materials, a lot of imagery of Eden, and that's an indication of the economic and political power of Israel at the time of this united kingdom under King Solomon and under King David. And Solomon also built a palace that took twice as long to build as the temple did. So how do you think he paid for such tremendous building projects? King Solomon paid for them with taxes, tremendous taxes. In fact, when he passed away, according to the Tanakh, when his son took the throne, Solomon's son took the throne, the tribes of Israel sent him a request to alleviate the taxes, to decrease the taxes that Solomon had raised in order to do all these incredible building projects. But his son, King Rehoboam, refused, and as a result, the northern tribes split from Judah and became a separate country. So the kingdom divided at that point. The tribe of Benjamin joined with Judah. And due to this division, they ultimately failed. And first Israel, the northern kingdoms, were captured by Assyria. Assyria conquered them. And then later Judah, the southern kingdom, was captured by Babylon. And they were the people who survived the war were hauled off as forced refugees to Babylon and basically turned into servants and slaves, etc. And this is well recorded history at this point. It's a recent enough history that we have enough evidence that these are definitely historical events. The destruction of Jerusalem and the temple, of course, when the Babylonians conquered the southern kingdom, Judah, they destroyed Solomon's temple and they destroyed Jerusalem in the process. So this was the onset of the first Jewish diaspora, meaning diaspora, think of the spores that you blow on a dandelion when it's dried up. You blow on it and that's what diaspora ultimately means. And so we have this first Jewish diaspora and people from Jerusalem moving to a number of different regions throughout the Mediterranean world. And in fact, they even ended up in areas like Ethiopia and also China. There's a region in China where people have been found to be descended from Jewish diaspora as well. Now, while refugees in Babylon, they were basically forced servants, forced slaves, and at the mercy of the Babylonian, as you can see here in this ancient relief, this Babylonian captor and the slaves being who are bound, heading to serve in whatever capacity they are required to serve. Now, during this time of hopelessness of these refugees or slaves, this gives rise to a period of prophecies about a promised messianic age. So we have a number of books in the Tanakh that are written as promises to these people who are suffering under the control of the Babylonian Empire, that things will get better. You will ultimately get to return to your homeland. And this is an important period of the prophetic writings of the Tanakh. And by prophetic, we mean a prophecy is a message from God according to the Tanakh. That's how that it is defined. And prophecy often promises sometimes good, sometimes bad things about the future. And a prophet, in the context of the Tanakh, is a messenger from God. God tells them what to say. They tell the people what God says. And so this is the period of prophetic writings, this period of their exile in Babylon. And during this time, this idea of a Messiah develops. Literally, the Messiah means the anointed one, and it is a reference to the ancient practice of anointing kings with oil when they took the throne. So there's this promise, this prophecy of that a king will come and set things to right for the Jewish people. And so that's the idea of Messiah is an expected king that's going to set things to right, an anointed one. An anointed one is a king. So before the time of Messiah, I brought these things from Jewfact.org because there are so many different ways of interpreting the Messianic age. I wanted to make sure to give you the Jewish understanding, and this is an Orthodox Jewish website that's well established and authoritative. So one of the prophets, whose name was Ezekiel, said that before the time of the Messiah, there would be war and suffering. And these prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Hosea, the Messiah will bring about political and spiritual redemption of the Jewish people by bringing them back to Israel and restoring Jerusalem. So that was a promise that was made while they were in exile. And another promise that was made to the Jewish people was that the Messiah would establish a government in Israel that would be the center of all world government for both Jews and Gentiles. And non-Jews are referred to as Gentiles. And so there's this promise that this Messiah, whoever this anointed king will be, he will actually rule over the whole earth, both Jewish and non-Jewish people. That's one of the prophecies in the Tanakh. And according to the prophecies in the Tanakh, according to this Jeremiah, he will rebuild the temple and reestablish the worship. Remember, we studied a little bit of what things took place in the temple, sacrifices and things like that. Well, in the tabernacle, which was then carried over into the temple. And so that was prophesied as well. And he will restore the religious court system of Israel and establish Jewish law as the law of the land. So this idea of the laws, the mitzvot, would be the law of the land, according to the prophet Jeremiah, when this messianic age, when this Messiah comes, when this king comes to restore the Jewish people. So then let's take a look at our Where Are We Going from your notes from a previous period. This is the IB, expectations of what you should know about how Judaism answers the question, where are we going? Judaism emphasizes observance in this life rather than elaborating on the hereafter. There is, however, an expectation of a messianic age of peace and justice for humankind. So this is another expectation of the messianic age. Peace and justice. One of the prophets writes about a lion lying down with the lamb, meaning there wouldn't even be fighting among animals. Whether you want to take that poetically or literally depends on the Jewish person reading it. For humankind in this world and a belief in Olam Ha Ba, the world to come. So Olam Ha Ba and the Messianic Age. Some Jewish people use the term Messianic Age and Olam Ha Ba synonymously. They use them to mean the same thing. Some Jewish people, however, consider the Messianic Age to be a future period in human history, and Olam Ha Ba to mean the afterlife, although it means the world to come. But it's some sort of, supernatural existence, this Olam Ha Ba, depending on which Jewish person you talk to. Now there's an assignment 082 for you to complete to go further on this concept of Messianic Age and Olam Ha Ba, because many times the paper one requires you to write an entire page just on the idea of Olam Ha Ba or the Messianic Age. So you need a little bit of detail there. So I've created an assignment for you to work on that. Now, after this period, this prophetic period, basically that's the end of the Tanakh. When they are, at some point, they are returned to the area of Jerusalem. In fact, Persia, if you can see here, Persia conquers the Babylonians who were holding the Jewish people captive. And when the Persian king, Cyrus the Great, succeeded in conquering Babylon, he allowed the Jewish people to return to their homeland. The Persian regime was much more sympathetic to the Jewish people than the Babylonian one had been. And so this is the return from exile, 516 BCE, again, another historic event that is well documented. And so at that point, the Second Temple begins to be built. And according to secular sources, the Second Temple was completed by 516 BC. Rabbinic sources put it much later, 350 BC, of it being completed. And Hanukkah is a celebration of a rededication of the Second Temple in Jerusalem, and there's a whole story of the Maccabees you could research to learn more about Hanukkah, but it has to do with reconsecrating the Second Temple. Now, eventually, the Romans conquer that area, and so Israel comes under the control of the Roman Empire, and after the life period of the next religion we're going to study, Jesus of Nazareth, after that life period, ultimately, there's a rebellion, a Jewish rebellion against the Roman rule, and the Second Temple is destroyed, and the second Jerusalem is ransacked again. If you go to Rome, you can find this triumphal arch in which they depict what they have done, that they take all the good stuff, all the gold out of the temple, the Second Temple, and this is their celebration that they conquered the Jewish people once again. And you can see this in Rome if you ever travel there. And so then we have a second Jewish diaspora of Jewish people scattering throughout the Roman Empire to get away from this destruction at Jerusalem, with a lot of death of Jewish people. Now, the second return, that was the second exile, the second return took place relatively recently. We had this movement called Zionism, which of course is named after that Mount Zion, that's the mount on which Jerusalem is built, and it ultimately got force when Europeans and Americans came into the concentration camps following World War II and saw how poorly the Jewish people had been treated, and there was a certain level of remorse. A lot of countries had not helped them when they had opportunity, including the United States, and as a gesture of remorse, the UN helped establish the state of Israel, an independent state, and a place for the Jewish people to have a homeland. The only problem is that at the time that they made that decision, this whole area was mostly, the green is the Palestinian populations living in that area, and the white is the Jewish populations living in that area. And then the UN planned for there to be the white area for Jewish people to have their own land, and the green area for Palestinians to be moved to, a forced move. So they didn't solve the Jewish problem very well, in that they displaced a lot of people from their homes. The UN forcefully displaced a lot of Arab people to different areas, and we're still suffering, a lot of unrest as a result of this forced migration by the UN to give the Jewish people a state, an independent state. So now we can see these green areas are where Palestinian people have been walled off, and that's creating all kinds of humanitarian issues in terms of, well, you can look it up on Amnesty International, in terms of how the Israeli military treats the Palestinians who are under their control ultimately.